Afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this sunny Thursday. We have got a really interesting webinar planned for you today. We've got Holly and Eleanor that are going to take us through some slides around the opportunity that agroforestry can present to farm businesses. We still have some people joining us, but I will kick off with housekeeping. So this webinar is going to be recorded, so you're all on mute and no cameras are showing. It'll be available on YouTube shortly after the webinar, and we'll send the link round to everybody afterwards, so you can catch up and forward on to colleagues or friends. We do ask that if you've got any questions, you pop it in the chat. And upvote any questions that are particularly pertinent to you. So you can just give them a thumbs up rather than duplicating questions. We'll aim to get to as many of these as possible. We're going to leave them to the end. And yeah, as I say, we'll send out all of the links to the resources that we reference throughout the presentation. And we'll send a link to the webinar as well. So our speakers today, as I mentioned, are Holly Savage and Eleanor Marks. Both are agroforestry woodland officers in our Southwest area team. They'll take us through the slides. They'll also be available for follow-up, and we'll provide you with their email addresses. So if you have got specific questions that are relevant to your site or your project, that will be the best way. We're probably not going to be able to answer site-specific questions today, but more general questions around agroforestry. Just having a look at the agenda and what we'll cover, we'll look through our different agroforestry systems and the definitions of agroforestry, the benefits that it can provide to ecosystem services. We'll look at the principles of agroforestry, so looking at objectives for doing it, the design through to establishment and management. We'll also look at the funding options that are available, any further considerations, and next steps really for your project and your ambitions for creating an agroforestry system. So without further ado, I will hand over to my colleague Holly, who'll take control of the slides.
Yep.
And over to you, Holly.
Grand. Okay, thank you for that, Becca. Yeah, hi everyone, my name's Holly. So I'm going to be doing the first half of this webinar. As Becca said, I'll be covering the sort of definitions of agroforestry and how that might look in the farming landscape. I know that there's going to be very different audiences that are tuning in today who might know loads about agroforestry, be an agroforestry expert, and just want to see what we're talking about from the FC point of view. And there might be people who, have heard this buzzword being talked about a lot in the farming landscape and in the public sort of eye, but don't really know much about it. So I'm sort of going to go back a bit to basics at the beginning. Essentially just trying to break down the definition of agroforestry. So what is agroforestry? So I've got a couple of things up on the slide that you can hopefully see at the moment. Essentially, agroforestry is the integration of trees into the farming landscape or into the farming system. So trees that are used to maintain or enhance a farm's main agricultural output. So that could be establishing more trees that you already have on your farming landscape to benefit your farming environment and business as a whole, or using the trees themselves as a farming method and as a tool in a toolbox to, enhance and produce your business objectives. So as it says there on the slide, agroforestry is the growing of both trees and agricultural or horticultural crops on the same piece of land. They're designed to provide tree and other crop products and at the same time protect, conserve, diversify and sustain vital economic, environmental and human and natural resources. So moving on to breaking that down even further, going into the different types of agroforestry systems. So again, you might have heard some of these phrases before, but not really know too much about the detail of them. So the first one that we'll look into is hedgerows, shelter belts, riparian buffer strips. So obviously a lot of people will be familiar with hedgerows, might have heard about shelter belts, maybe riparian buffer strips, but these are often the features that we already find in the farming landscape on the farms. That'll be the hedgerows amongst the fields, the shelter belts that have been planted or exist to kind of buffer those more exposed areas, windier areas, and then riparian buffer strips, which is essentially trees that are implanted around a waterway or a water body, used to sort of conserve that water area, using it to protect from, giving it shading and keeping it cool and things like that, helping to prevent runoff, flooding risks, all those sorts of things. The next one is silvopastoral. So that is the combination of livestock and trees. So essentially just taking silver, meaning tree, and then tacking it onto the pastoral element. The same with silvo arable. So silvo arable is the combination of arable crops and trees. Similar thing again, just got the silvo, meaning tree, and arable being the arable agricultural product. The other elements that we have in agroforestry systems that some people might not be as familiar with, forest farming being one of them. So that is the cultivation of crops within the forest environment. So all these different dynamic levels of a forest can be replicated in a forest garden, where you have the higher canopy, the understory, and then growing crops or products on the ground level as well. So really using and utilizing all those different elements of that system. And then the other one being the home garden. So multi-layers of vegetation, a bit similar to a forest garden, but using trees amongst your vegetables that can supply fruit and shelter and things like that at a more individual level. The two that we're mainly going to be focusing on in this presentation are the silvo arable and the silvopastoral systems, but that's not to say that we won't touch on the hedgerow, shelter belt, and riparian buffer strips a little bit as well. But these are the more common types of agroforestry that are often implemented or already exist on the farming landscape. So breaking it down even further, we're going to look at the agroforestry spectrum. So for some people, they might have already seen these kind of images that we'll go through now, but I think it's a really great way of just even further, taking apart that agroforestry definition and seeing what that actually means on the ground. So the first and foremost thing being about wide hedges and windbreaks, as well as the hedgerows with trees. So these again are things that we might see more commonly on the farm already existing. Then moving on to shelter belts and shelter networks. So you're getting broader from having these trees in the hedgerows, bulking out into these windbreak, kind of wider hedges, goes into shelter belts and shelter networks. Typically, shelter belts are more like 10 to 20 meters in width. But these are often used and can be very, very useful for protecting certain areas from crop spray, exposed winds, things like that. Moving on then into the infield sort of different types of systems, the ones that I previously mentioned being the on-field types. So infield, we're looking at open low density tree planting. That might be something people are familiar with, that kind of parkland type planting, really wide space scattered throughout the landscape. Then we go on to the infield agroforestry, which is that sort of classic look of, trees in rows or trees scattered around in that kind of informal or formal grid planting. So that can, just be similar to the orchards or trees being in a line, or that kind of scattered sort of tree cover for your grazing livestock. Jump back, go forwards. There we go. So the next one, moving on to wood pasture and traditional orchards. So again, a familiar part of our landscape. This is has a sort of historical attachment to it. So wood pasture and traditional orchards do come from more of a sort of habitat objective. A lot of the time, they're used for these habitats and ecosystems that exist in these sort of more ecologically sensitive areas, but they are still a method of agroforestry and can be used for silvo arable or silvopastoral methods. And then, as we mentioned before, we've got the riparian buffer planting. We also have field corners, copses, and small woodlands, those areas that, again, can be used to sort of buffer out the kind of hedgerows in those corners of the field, buffering them out to provide areas of shelter. Then we also have existing woodland. So that's a method of agroforestry where you have existing woodland on the farm, where you introduce managed grazing into that woodland system for a grazing plan, and also woodland creation. So that can be new woodland creation with longer term agroforestry intentions. So for example, things like green barns might be something that people have heard of, where you're planting quite densely planted trees in an area, but then using them to provide shade and shelter and cover in a quite dense format for animals such as poultry, sheep, as well as cattle. And then there are other agroforestry types. So we've got short rotation coppice for fodder or bioenergy that people do as well. So moving on to, what have the trees ever done for us? I might be aging myself here. I hope that people in the audience know what I'm referring to with the help of Monty Python. Um, but the joke being in Monty Python, what have the Romans ever done for us? What have the trees ever done for us? So just a quick run through of what the trees have ever done for us. They provide shade, shelter, soil improvement, water quality and retention, longer outdoor grazing seasons. They are, enhancing biodiversity. They carbon sequester, live weight gain increasing, live birth rate increasing, increased egg production, crop and soil desiccation avoidance, as well as wildlife habitat enhancement, timber products, wood fuel products. They can do planning screening as well, biosecurity, feed substitute, bedding substitute, reduced inputs, and animal medicinal benefits, as well as integrated pest management. So that's a lot of things that I've just thrown out there. So, trees have done a lot for us. But sort of breaking this down further into the kind of agroforestry ecosystem services, it can kind of be summed up underneath these headings of trees regulating, supporting, providing, and culturally improving and enhancing the farmed landscape. So when we look at it with regulating, carbon sequestration through tree biomass, as we know, we need to reduce our carbon footprint, our carbon impact in our country. So trees can be a really good method of doing that. Trees can reduce erosion, surface runoff, leaching from the land. They can reduce, soil erosion reduces long-term fertility by removing nutrient-rich topsoil and organic matter, which crops are relying on for healthy growth. So trees can really stabilize that. They hold the soil structure together and act as a sort of physical barrier to soil movement. And then that also links into improving resilience to drought and floods. So trees can just hold more water in the land, whether they're holding it within their root structures again or through their actual physical form. They can slow the flow, reducing flooding downstream, but then also provide more water content when we have those longer, hotter and drier summers that we're seeing. And they can improve water and air quality on the farm. So that sort of filtration network that trees do can be, up to 60 times higher than just through grass alone. And more filtration means that less water will flow over the ground surface, and that links back to that kind of surface runoff issue that we often see on farms. Supporting as well, so trees being in the farm landscape, they can provide a habitat to maintain, support and enhance species diversity. We all know that having trees provides a home for lots of different types of animals, whether they be pollinators and invertebrates that are going to help with the pollination of your crops, but then also it provides a place for the predators of any pests that you might have. So looking at the bats, birds, species that can find homes in the trees that they planted, as well as providing, so they can, deliver better animal welfare and enhance food production potential, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But they also can provide, a crop in themselves. You can grow high value hardwood timber through planting trees and establishing them successfully. There is a cultural impact, of course, as well. We are a nation of tree lovers, so they can improve the landscape aesthetics by having more trees. They offer environmental and rural education opportunities. So we hear a lot about forest schools, these learning opportunities, and they provide environmental recreation. We know that well-being and health connected to trees and being out in the woodland and tree environment is so critical for us. So this is a way of providing that opportunity as well. I'm hoping this video is going to work okay for everyone to see, but this is a longhorn just happily grazing on some hawthorn there, which I thought would be a nice thing to see while I talk about the benefits that trees have on the livestock potential through shade and shelter. So one of the biggest things is in this country, as we're seeing, we're getting more extreme weather events, hotter, drier, longer summers, those colder periods with storms. So temperature regulation is really, really important, and trees can provide this. They can help maintain optimal body temperature and efficient live weight gain. So looking at the stats there, cold stress, for every 1 degree below that an animal is, they need an extra 2% of feed required to maintain their internal body temperature. And a wind chill of -7 adds an extra 14% feed required to maintain this core temperature for them. So if you're adding wet weather into this, each animal will require an extra 46% feed just to maintain themselves. Okay, so that's just to keep themselves going at sort of like that base level of just existing, let alone producing young or producing food like milk or anything like that. And then the same is going to the other side from cold stress to heat stress. Heat stress is much more critical importance cold stress, and it can be triggered in an animal when they're at temperatures of, from 18 degrees onwards. So livestock, as we know, you're looking out across the field on a really hot day. Where are they all going to be? They're going to be in the shade under the trees. They seek shade to avoid heat stress, but a lot of fields don't actually have a lot of shade opportunity for them. So it means that when you're out in the heat, as we all know, when it's a hot day, you don't really want to eat, don't really want to move around that much. Non-vital systems will shut down to maintain their core internal body temperature at the optimum level. So digestion and reproductive systems will be affected by this. It can mean that you have negative fertility impacts. So on the reproductive system, that means smaller offspring born, more health hazards, more exposure to things like disease and stuff like that. And the example there being that production loss has been calculated, linked to heat and cold stress effects, $400 million for US beef alone. So it is really, really important that we keep our animals shaded and sheltered from these weather impacts. The other thing, can I play the video again? I'll play the video again while we're just talking about nutrition. The other thing being that, so trees, obviously, as we know, provide shade and shelter for animals, and they will seek them out naturally when they need to. But they are an added benefit of having that improved nutrition. As you can see, that longhorn happily munching on some hawthorn. Multiple different species have multiple different benefits from their nutrition, can have beneficial minerals. We often hear terms like salicins and, different cobalts and things like that. But these come naturally in the format of these different browsing opportunities and fodder for animals. So trees and shrubs can provide a more diverse diet through the availability of browse. So that can be not just the leaves, but the twigs as well. Bark stripping, all those sorts of natural behaviours that they would be doing naturally. Livestock can selectively browse, but it is worth pointing out they don't always get it right, and it is worth noting that there are some species that wouldn't be as palatable and beneficial to certain animals and livestock. For instance, sycamore isn't that great for horses in huge, large quantities. But that's not to villainize sycamore. It's just to know that if they don't have the opportunity to have other browsing material available, they might go for things that aren't as beneficial for them. So that is something to bear in mind. But if it is available for them, tree browse can make up to 12% of a cattle diet, 20% of sheep diet throughout the year, and that can increase as well. So if they have those opportunities for browse as well as grazing through the grass, they can bulk up their diets with that. And yeah, generally, nutritional content of the browse is comparable to grass. So another thing to note is that grass diets don't contain any tannins. So tannins are very, very sticky when they're in the digestive system, and they can keep the methane levels down in certain animals because it keeps it all together and binds it to the other things that they're eating. So it can reduce your methane levels on the farm if you're introducing these tannins in that tree fodder. And who knows, tree leaves might have the potential to one day be replacing mineral box, which is another output, sorry, on your farm that you're having to do. The trees might be able to do it naturally for you. So this is just a case study that I think is really, really great to highlight. So it's a bit of information overload on the slide, but essentially what we're looking at here is just the effects that trees can have on livestock. So this is in the poultry industry. This is the Lakes Free Range Egg Company. And like I say, there's a lot of information on there, but essentially the things that you need to just note are, you guessed it, the money side of it, and the fact that that is helped by the tree cover. So what we're looking at here is a decrease in bird mortality and a decrease in egg seconds. So egg seconds being the less valuable egg product. You really want the class A eggs from your birds to produce more money. And by having tree cover, that has helped save them just over £10,500 per flock. So they have planted about 15 hectares of woodland at this site, which is a mixture of oak, silver birch, sycamore, ash, field maple, hawthorn, blackthorn, wild cherry, holly, and hazel. So a real mixture of native species. It was planted in 1997, and their objectives were to basically provide cover for their free-range hens, improve the biodiversity on the farm, and then sequester carbon emissions and ammonia. On top of that, they've been able to, see this reduction in costs as well. So, yeah, just an example of we can sometimes see all the benefits that trees can give on our farms just through anecdotal measures and things like that. But there are examples out there that can only pick one for this presentation. There are lots. There are examples out there that show that there are, financial benefits to having trees on your farm as well. So going a little bit more into the, types of systems that we will see in the agroforestry spectrum and seeing a bit more of visualization for them now. So going on to silver pasture, we've got the silver pasture formal systems being one. So these are generally planted in a grid system, but they have variety of spacing and densities. And trees can be planted not only for livestock benefits, but as a secondary crop as well. So you could be using that as a fruit or nut product, or you could be using it for hardwood timber, as is used in this example here. So this, what we're looking at in this image is 35-year-old ash silver pasture. It's a bit distant, but there are some sheep grazing underneath those trees. So the initial planting density for this one was 400 stems per hectare. The first year thin was at year 13, and that reduced it to 300 stems per hectare, with 2 further thins to how it currently is at 120 stems per hectare. So although it's ash, it was planted before, the dreaded ash dieback outbreak. You can see that we have really good quality timber in this image. It's been pruned well. You have nice straight trees. So these trees have been looked after, but they have the added benefit of shading and sheltering those animals that are grazing underneath. If you're planting in this kind of formal system as well, it means that you have easier access for thinning, pruning, and harvesting later on down the line, which is something that's really important to think of. And then moving on to our informal systems, looks a little bit different to those kind of formalized grid patterns. But this is something, again, you might recognize more in the landscape. That's that sort of wood pasture system that I mentioned earlier, maybe that parkland setting. So this is a mixture of sort of cluster planting or single trees out in the landscape. It's a bit more suitable for certain areas as well. If you have certain hilly areas and things like that, being planted on a gradient or existing on sloped landscapes. There are differences in the sort of habitat that you can create here, as you can see in the images, the sort of understories as well as the higher trees. So it can allow you to mix in different objectives. So if you're looking for that biodiversity gain, that can be done here, planting in roundels or, more scattered but denser planting in areas. That is that sort of more informal way of having that system. And then moving on to the row system. So again, it's a bit more of a formalized method. Instead of planting in sort of scattered grid formation, planting in rows. So it looks a lot more structured, but it can have the benefit of creating paddocks. So if you're doing that rotational grazing system, that is a big part of regenerational farming, this can be really, really beneficial because you can utilize these rows for your different grazing patterns and moving your animals on more easily throughout the different days. Also, having multiple tree rows, sort of you can balance that timber growth as well as forage for your livestock. So as you can see in that bottom photograph, we have a lot more trees in this fenced off area. So that could be used for allowing that to grow up to create a nice dense block essentially that will allow the animals to come in when you want them to and browse, or you could be using it to produce some nice quality timber is in that photo above, that cherry that's got this nice tall structure, but still has the benefit of shade and shelter if you need it to for those animals to go in underneath. And yeah, you can plant a high density of trees whilst minimizing shading when you're first establishing. Next one that going on to is the row systems for silver arable instead. So this allows for machinery access when you do wide spacings between your trees as well. So this is something that Eleanor's going to mention after I finish speaking about agroforestry designs, where you really need to do it to suit your landscape. But as long as you have enough space for your machinery to pass through, this can be really, really beneficial because your trees can shelter those crops from exposure, water loss through the evaporation of exposure and things like that. So cultivation also prunes the tree roots, so it will send your roots further down for more stable trees as well. And yeah, the water can be accessed at different levels. So it's not that you're out competing the crops that are on the ground having the trees there, because water, yeah, is accessed at different levels. You can plant a high density of trees as well and also minimize that shading. So that example on the right hand side, that image, so that's from an East Anglia farm. It's on a 15-year farm business tenancy. They've done their serial alleys in between the trees at 24 meters wide, which allows for 3 passes of an 8-meter wide machinery, I think. Those 3-meter wide areas of the trees, they have an uncultivated strip which has apple trees. So they're going to have that secondary product of apple crop. They have timber if they want it as well, and they also have a browsing ability as well. So that's the great thing about the silver arable to silver pastoral systems. When it's in a row, you can choose to have that flexibility. In some years, you might have crops growing in between, or you might just leave it to go to pasture, do hay cut, run the animals through. Different opportunities are there. So they're at the East Anglia farm, they're still growing 100% of the cereal yield, even though they've had to do it on only 90% of the land, because they've given 10% over to the trees being grown there. But they haven't seen a loss in what they're producing despite having the trees. If anything, it will have increased because now they have that additional product through that apple product as well. So yeah, so that's I think the last of my bit. I've hopefully given a good introduction to what agroforestry can look like, what the different systems are, how that can be on your farm and all the benefits that it can bring. And I'll hand over to Eleanor now, who's going to talk about the different sort of designs and how you would go about incorporating agroforestry onto your farm itself. All good to go,
Oh,
Eleanor?
yeah, all good. Just a quick reminder to anybody who's hoping to ask a question, please do send one in. There's no question too big or small. And yeah, we're looking forward to answering those at the end. Right, so over to what I'm covering today. I'm going to be just chatting over sort of our key agroforestry principles, and then going into a few design considerations and ideas for you. So when it comes to agroforestry, there are the sort of key 5 principles to consider, both for existing agroforestry or trees on your farm, and also potentially new agroforestry projects that that you're looking into. And they are establishing your objectives, deciding on location, the design of your agroforestry system, its establishment, and then looking into the future at its management and the implications of that. Within this, it's also important to think about financial help, whether you are looking to be grant funded. But I'd really like to stress the fact that agroforestry should be shaped for your farm, for your business and objectives, and not just the funding, but we'll touch on funding at the end, because we know it's a really important element of agroforestry for people at the moment. So jumping straight in, when it comes to thinking about your objectives, it's really about identifying what you want your agroforestry system to provide or achieve or help with. Agroforestry, as we've seen, is no one thing. It should be seen as a piece of kit, as a tool on your farm. But it could also, in terms of your objectives, it also could be potentially opening up a new market opportunity in your area. Perhaps your objective is to diversify your business, become more resilient, both on a financial and an environmental side of things. Perhaps you want to overcome an issue or a challenge, whether that's runoff or animal health, as I go on to there. So improving animal health, easing animal and livestock management, perhaps decreasing costs around feed, animal housing, irrigation potentially due to water loss. And maybe your objectives are actually biodiversity. Maybe you want to see certain species come back into your landscape, and trees could be a really important tool to achieving that. And is your objective, as I mentioned earlier, grant funded or not? So how are your next steps going to be influenced by that? But ultimately, at each stage, come back to your objectives and just review whether it's achieving what you set out to do at the start. The next principle is the location. So where are the best places to perhaps start off your agroforestry journey or even expand your existing system? This can be done by looking at what already is on your farm, what trees are already established, what's growing well, what perhaps needs a bit more cover, as Holly sort of mentioned. Looking at the topography of your farm as well, prevailing winds, considering what trees are needed and sort of the design elements that follow. Also access to infrastructure. So when it comes to agroforestry, if you're wanting to perhaps harvest a tree crop, perhaps you need to think of, right, where's going to be the easiest place for that for me to efficiently harvest and store and process those products, whether they're fruit or not. Also, where do you need them most? Where can you really optimize these benefits, especially if you're starting out? Don't get overwhelmed by needing a whole farm plan. Where's your sort of low-hanging fruit, and focus in on that perhaps to start off. And where's going to be easy and feasible to manage as well. Agroforestry's got a range of establishment stages and management involved, so it's important to be realistic about where you can get to achieve the objectives that you've set out at the start. When it comes to design, it's important to look at your species choice as well as tree spacing. The grant has a few requirements around tree spacing. Also your layout as well, so whether it's a grid system, the rows that we've already looked into, a mix of the two, or whether you do want to focus on your parcel edges instead. Orientation is also a really important element of design. So typically, if your objectives are to have sort of optimal sunlight for perhaps a silver arable system, then we typically see north to south rows with alleys in between. And so that figure at the bottom, which hopefully has popped up, yeah, it's popped up. It's just a graph to show that shading impact. So on the left is east to west. So if shading isn't such a concern for you, perhaps shelter is more of a focus, then it doesn't matter so much, and you might be preferring an east to west orientation. But yeah, if you'd like to limit that shading in the alleys, then north to south orientation might be an element of your design worth thinking about. Establishment is a really important thing. We are not just about planting trees. Us at Forestry Commission, as well as people who are establishing the systems, are not just about planting them, but establishing them and establishing what should be seen as a really vital piece of kit or equipment on the farm. I heard from one farmer we should be stopping using the word tree altogether, which I quite liked. It was like, no, we're not just planting trees, we're planting fodder, we're planting shelter, we're planting something that has value and is useful to the system, which is essentially what agroforestry is aiming to achieve. So when it comes to establishment, tree planting is obviously a very important stage, making sure that you've got the labour available, or you're able to actually undertake the planting either in phases or at different stages. Mulching is really recommended to help give those trees a good start, especially when it comes to water retention and weed suppression, which I mentioned later there, and tree protection and guarding. So just like woodlands, these trees are going to be potentially vulnerable to things like squirrels and deer, but also sheep and livestock, as well as, hares and voles and everything. So it's a really important element of establishment, is how you're going to be protecting these trees and giving them a good start. The final principle is on management. So this is sort of looking into the future, and especially with agroforestry trees, they require a level of management depending on your objectives. So a pruning regime that's suited for fruit and nut trees might be different to a pruning regime that's for timber, if that's what you're aiming for instead. Also, if you're aiming for a certain density, whether that's through grant requirements or your established sort of shelter objectives, then replacing unsuccessful trees is really important. Perhaps thinning out trees as they become established or aren't as productive. Tree health is important too, as well as future outputs. So as the agroforestry scheme matures, is it still delivering your objectives that you set out in the future? And if not, how can you perhaps change that or shape it to what your future outputs may be? So just thinking, oh, is it showing? Right, okay. Sorry, have I gone forward? Is it showing the sort of changes?
Yeah, it was showing the lines.
Ah, okay, cool. Sorry, it must just be what it's doing on my computer, but that's all good. Right, so this is sort of putting those principles into practice, I suppose. This farm is not in any kind of well, it's not to scale really at all, as you can hopefully see. And it's really just to identify what a design might look like on your farm map. So it's a bit rudimental, but but hopefully it'll be useful to sort of illustrate what we've been talking about. So what have we got? So we've got this farm with a mixture of fields. I've got an arable field here and some grazing, sort of grazing paddocks. And first thing I did really is look at the low-hanging fruit. So where did I want more trees, perhaps to shelter my home, like the infrastructure, where I enjoy walking the dog, where am I getting sort of blasted by wind, where could that be more sheltered? And in this example, you could perhaps start with establishing those hedgerows and boundary features, as Holly mentioned. And where do I already have trees that I can enhance here? So whether that's planting in up little copses or things like that. Alternatively, an objective might be actually new enterprises. So in this design, I've put in some sort of an alley cropping system. The arrow represents the north orientation. So I've got north to south alleys. I've got enough space, so about 45 meters apart, so that I can cultivate in between these rows. And then trees within those green lines are about 3 meters apart as well. And so so I've started off with that idea. And then a bit close to home, I put in sort of perhaps a grid system in some pasture land, and then also nice and accessible, perhaps a small orchard. Again, just want to reiterate, the symbols are trees and are definitely not exactly to scale. But here's just a few examples of what that might look like in the landscape. So silver arable system, and then this is, flock of sheep under some walnut trees. Actually, your farm might not be arable at all. You're purely a livestock system. So for example, we've got a range of pasture. And so that north-south orientation doesn't matter so much. Shelter here is the main objective. And so, yeah, what I really want is rows of browsable trees, perhaps, that I can also anchor my grazing cells to as well, and provide that flow of livestock, as Holly mentioned, in terms of a tactic and a way of using agroforestry. Still space perhaps to take a hay cut between rows. Still got a range of sort of informal planting in other paddocks or other pastures. And then here are a few examples in a sort of a poultry setting. And then, yeah, informal, so clustering of trees in pasture. So if I get rid of that image. So here's just another design. So actually looking at the topography of the farm. So say this farm, we're actually facing water runoff issues from the hills around us. What we have got here is contour planting or keyline planting, where trees are planted in rows that follow the natural sort of contours of the landscape to help slow the flow of water, increase infiltration, and yeah, provide shelter as well. We can also see a few trees in different forms across a hilled landscape as well. So going to see hopefully reduced erosion, better water quality in the streams and further down. And yeah, another focus or objective might be landscape aesthetics. So in this case, I might be super motivated to be using local species that already fit in with the characteristics of the area too. So here's just an example of sort of upland planting. Here's a multi-field design concept from Ed Colbert. So this is a whole field report, and hopefully here you can see there's a real range, almost every type of agroforestry. It is whole farm, so yeah, don't feel like you have to sort of replicate things like this. You can start small and start with what you're really interested in as well. But there's silver pasture, silver arable, there's a grazed orchard, also roundels as well, which are quite interesting. And so yeah, there's a sort of real life version other than the shape files that I've just walked you through. So coming back to the agroforestry spectrum, just wanted to highlight that there is a really diverse sort of grant landscape around agroforestry. However, what we're going to be focusing on is this in-field agroforestry system, so the grid planting and sort of the alley planting that we spoke about earlier. So for in-field agroforestry, there are three main elements of the funding. We've got capital grants, and which are grant funding for the actual agroforestry tree, with elements of management and maintenance around that particular tree. So you've got AF1 for agroforestry woodland tree, and AF2 for agroforestry fruit tree, as well as AF3, which is there to encourage diversity in the species that's requested. And then we've also got a PA4, which is the agroforestry plan, and this is standalone, and so is really recommended as that starting point for your agroforestry. We also got countryside stewardship higher tier, which is supporting agroforestry revenue payments from very low density to high density. And we did until recently have SFI. There are agreements that are live, but hopefully this sort of next phase of animations will sort of instill that SFI is no longer open to new applicants. However, we are still set with capital grants and countryside stewardship higher tier revenue grants. Main thing is that the PA4 agroforestry plan is open, and this is a really important part of your countryside stewardship higher tier pre-application process, which currently is the only sort of agroforestry or in-field agroforestry funding option that's available. And then when it comes to agroforestry capital and higher tier, we're hoping that, we're all set for them to be released in the summer this year. So yeah, just to recap, SFI is closed to new applicants. The PA4 is open, and you need that PA4 signed by the FC and by Natural England as part of your pre-application process for countryside stewardship higher tier actions. Holly, I was going to pass on to you for sort of the PA4 in a bit more detail, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I'll just help round us out then, just to talk about, that PA4 that Eleanor mentioned. Thanks for that. So yeah, the PA4 agroforestry plan, as you can see on there, the funding price of that is £1,268.08. Can't forget that 8p. It's very important. So just basically to go into a bit more detail about this, just briefly. The PA4 plan is a funded plan option, like Eleanor said. It is the pre-application process for being eligible for the countryside stewardship higher tier agroforestry options that are releasing in the summer, both the revenue and the capital. Essentially, the plan is a whole farm approach plan. It is a really, really great tool of being able to explore agroforestry as a possibility for, an applicant's land, how agroforestry might sit within your wider business, and how agroforestry might sit in your farming environment. It can also be used as a management plan to help design, plan, and plan and manage agroforestry parcels. So that can be used as well for existing agroforestry. You might have agroforestry already on your land, be ahead of the game, but want to utilise the plan in order to gain eligibility for the higher tier options coming out later, but also just to use it as an opportunity to look into your management techniques, whether you want to expand or create any more agroforestry. So it's not by any means just for new agroforestry applicants. It is a standalone item, so you can do it. It is not obligatory to carry out what you state in your plan, although we very much like applicants to. But you can do revisions and reviews of the plan as well, which we encourage. Like I said and Eleanor said, about if you're going to start off small and then increase your agroforestry amounts, you can use the plan to review that as well. And yeah, it says about it being optional for SFI. As Eleanor mentioned, SFI is closed for this year, but it's still something that we really, really encourage anyone to do if you're thinking about creating agroforestry or already have existing agroforestry on your farm. So just to sort of help round out, going on to the key considerations, I feel a bit bad that I'm just going to quickly sum up Eleanor's bit when you did such a good job detailing, all those different principles. But just to summarize, apply the principles that Eleanor mentions. That's your objectives, your location, the design element, the establishment, and the management to either an existing or proposed agroforestry systems. That's really key, just starting from the ground upwards. And then looking into, what funding is out there. We really encourage people to look at, like I say, their objectives, their principles before going to the funding, rather than the other way around, seeing what's out there monetarily and then trying to fit that. It might not work in the long term. That's the beneficial thing about the plan. It sees if agroforestry is going to work for you. We'd love it if every farm incorporated some format of agroforestry, but it might be it's just not practical for you to do so. But yeah, check out the grant requirements as well. There will be requirements and prescriptions from our funding through ELMS in terms of things like your density, your spacing, your location, and tree species. And then also you can ask yourself, as we saw on that agroforestry spectrum, would it be agroforestry, or could you maybe go down the UCO route? So the UCO being the English Woodland Creation Offer. as I mentioned earlier in that agroforestry spectrum, if you're interested in things like shelter belts or riparian planting, buffering out field corners and things like that, UCO would probably be the more optimum option for you, as long as you were planting a minimum of 1 hectare in size when you did that. UCO would be a really, really good tool to use that for. And then, yeah, following that out with completing the pre-application process, i.e. applying to do an agroforestry plan, would be the next step in that. So those are the sort of key things that we want people to take away from this presentation is, you know, looking at your objectives and your principles, seeing what funding is out there in the wider landscape, and then, yeah, getting started with that PA4. I think that's the last bit of our bit. I can stop talking now and hand back to you, Becca.
Thank you both. That was awesome. Thanks, Eleanor and Holly. That was really great. And yeah, just to underline and reiterate that there is support out there for planning and design, and there is support for planting establishment and long-term viability. As you mentioned, see what funding options are out there that match your objectives. There are other partners, not just ourselves, but there are community forests that you might fall into their boundaries and be eligible for some of their funding. There's also the Woodland Trust as well. But we will send around links to all of the resources and more information around funding options after the webinar. Yeah, as you said, next steps, consider agroforestry and woodland creation opportunities on your land. Have those clear objectives of why you want to create it. It needs to support wider business farm objectives. And then familiarise yourself with the regulation and the standards. So for woodland, that's the UK Forestry Standard. And yeah, remember, right tree in the right place for the right reasons. And if you have a site or a project, either yourself or if you're working with a farmer or landowner, please do get in touch with Eleanor and Holly. Again, we'll send around contact details for them. But those are the patches that they cover in the southwest region, and they will be able to advise on a case-by-case basis, potentially come and do a site visit if that's required. I just want to say massive thanks, Eleanor and Holly, and we'll go to some of the questions. I think some have been answered, but I think worth going over in case other people haven't been following the chat. So I think Michael put, when trees are spread around in a field where mechanised agriculture is practiced, how is this managed in terms of manoeuvring machines around trees? I'll come to you, Holly, if you wanted to come off mute and answer that.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it sort of was answered. I was trying to answer some questions in the chat while you were speaking, Eleanor, so sorry if I missed any or anything like that. But yeah, yeah, it's a great question. You know, you do have to think about these practicalities. So it goes back to that kind of design element and objective sort of thinking, really. So if you know that you need to use that field or whatever to get access to other areas of your farm, or you're doing, you know, like crop cutting and things like that, it really just comes down to the design of you knowing your farm and your area. So thinking about where's most difficult to turn the tractor and things like that, you wouldn't want to put a tree right in the middle of that space. So it's that familiarity with what you know is practical for you. And if it isn't practical to put trees in certain areas, then don't do it. We definitely wouldn't say do it for the sake of it or anything like that. It needs to be, it needs to work for you. It needs to work for your farming setup. That can be, you know, the smallest things, from just where you like to be able to see across your fields, your livestock, or, you know, where you need to drive through your farm machinery, how wide they are to get through these spacings and things like that. So as mentioned previously about that formal planting, rather than that kind of scattered planting, if you were doing it for, say, for silvopastoral benefits, thinking maybe more about that, you know, I can plant these trees over in this area because I know that that means I can get my machinery through, my mechanized, you know, tools in that area much more practically and easily than if I was to put it on this side of the field. But yeah, just do what works for you.
Thank you for that. Eleanor, I'm going to come to you for this next one. Michael asks, yeah, what are the challenges? I guess what are the main differences between normal agricultural practices and crops and agroforestry in terms of harvesting trees, replacing them, stump management, choice of species, that kind of thing? Are there some real big differences that probably farmers need to kind of be aware of?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And it's hard to sort of pinpoint an exact answer. I think the main element of it is the farmers, like they're going to see a very different timescale that they're going to be working on. And it's about appreciating that one element of the field is going to have a seasonal sort of a seasonal flow and a seasonal diary in such a way, while your trees have got much more of a long term process and sort of management and management elements related to that, whether it is timber and harvesting and things. And so that as much planning as possible is really recommended, and even looking at established systems that already exist, case studies, just to really inform yourself about what the future might hold, if it's quite hard for you to visualize as someone who hasn't grown trees on a commercial basis before. But yeah, that transition, that sort of blending of land uses is going to come up with various different challenges, whether that's a tree coming down over certain harvestable areas of crop. And so being diverse in your approach is going to make you the most resilient, and not perhaps putting all your eggs in one basket as such and covering the place in one go. I think I'd really recommend phasing out agroforestry across the farm and dealing with challenges as they come, really. But yeah, we hope that the benefits will outweigh those challenges, and in the long run, you'll see a really productive and an enjoyable sort of farming environment.
Thanks, Eleanor. Just some practical questions now around funding and applications. So Sally asks, can you request PA4 now if you're not in the higher tier pipeline list? If it's
Yes.
in a sensitive area ready for possible SFI in 2026 or higher tier in 2026?
Yep. So PA4 is open for applicants, and I think you can do it no matter where you are on that timeline. An important thing to look at, I think, is what is think of into the future of what revenue payments do you want that agroforestry to achieve, and what is that stackable with the other higher tier or SFI actions you want to do. So and you can sort of elaborate on this in your plan as well. We really recommend that. But yeah, so the PA4 is open. First step is to apply to do it from the RPA. So there's a sort of a capital application form. You send that to get an agreement, which goes live with the RPA. We then get notified. And then once that's come through to you, you can start the PA4. The template's already available online. And with that first draft, you send it directly to your relevant agroforestry woodland officer. And then there'll be a bit of toing and froing before sign off, which is done by the Forestry Commission and by Natural England. So that's sort of the process. And yeah.
Thanks, Eleanor. There is also just a following question from Sally. I think it links to the whole, do we need an agricultural EIA? Do we need a forestry EIA? So Sally asks, if you do high density trees in rows on arable land, could that land then be designated as forestry rather than agricultural?
Yeah. Do you want me to take that one, Eleanor, just because you took the last one?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, can do. Yeah, so that's a really common question that we get about if you're putting trees on agricultural land, does that mean that you've created a forest, created a woodland? Essentially, that's what our EIA process is about. So that's the environmental impact assessment, looking at whether or not that amount of planting would then be defined as woodland. But agroforestry systems, as they're designed, are unique in that, they are agroforestry. It is agricultural land that features trees on them. Obviously, if you're doing a lot, like you say, high density types of planting or things like those green barns that I mentioned earlier, where it's quite dense, it might be that you're going over into the definition of woodland. But it's just case by case, essentially. We'd have to look at so I know it sounds like a bit of a fobbing off answer, but it would just depend on the amount of trees that you have, their distancings, things like that, which is why in our funding descriptions and things on the government websites, we do talk about those densities and spacings and placements and things like that as well. That is the way that we work around whether or not you're creating woodland that you are then using in an agricultural agroforestry method, or if you're having agroforestry on your site. So yeah, if you as well want to get the agroforestry funding payments, it would need to stay obviously as an agricultural land code. We can't apply our government agroforestry funding to woodland defined areas.
Thank you, Holly. Also, we've got a couple of more questions. Darren has asked, are food forests acceptable on existing woodland, or do you need to start with agricultural land for it to be kind of defined as agroforestry, I guess?
That's a lovely question.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe Holly might have more experience with food forests. I think when it comes to the funding, it might struggle to be eligible, just in terms of the spacing requirements. I think usually in food forests it's very dense. You've got multiple layers of productive plants and crops that are all working together, and it is essentially a forest. I think in terms of woodland, or starting off with arable, I mean it depends on what's already there in that existing woodland and what that existing woodland is providing, and also whether you're adding things that are going to be able to compete with what's already in that environment. In some cases, if you want it to be quite dense and productive in a short amount of space, it will be easier to start on land that perhaps was agricultural and is really nutritionally dense in the topsoil, maybe has been enhanced in the past for that food forest objective. But I mean, I depending as well on how that woodland was established and the grant restrictions around it, I don't see any problem in sort of having a food forest in woodland or agricultural land. Holly, have you got anything to add to that?
Well, I was going to say Joe's got a hand up. She might have. I was just going to say, which Joe might say about this, just to be aware of when you're doing existing woodland, about like certain types of planting and things like that. But Joe, I'll let you, because I think you had something to say, so I'm going to let you answer.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think you're about to say it as well. I was just going to chip in. If it is an existing woodland, it's definitely worthwhile considering getting a woodland management plan in place, which we can support and help fund the writing for. There is really good grant money out there, and then when the higher tier opens, you can access lots of funding to help manage that woodland. So there's a bit of a misconception that it just needs to be woodlands for timber, but actually it's kind of all woodlands in there. So I will put in the chat just some links to that woodland management plan information and funding that you can access.
Thanks so much, Joe. Oh, yeah, sorry, Joe. Oh, thank you for that, Joe, and putting in the link. That's really useful. I think we've just got a couple more questions, unless anybody wants to start typing more in madly now. We've got one from Hugh. Once trees are established, what protection is needed when grazed with sheep and cattle? To either of you.
We're fighting for questions. I can go first and you can follow up, Eleanor, if there's anything I've missed. But yeah, it's a really great question. Again, it links back into our funding prescriptions as well. We do state that these trees need to be protected from sort of pests and damage, things like that, when you think of squirrel and deer impacts. But obviously, if you want to have these trees for fodder, they need to be browsable for the animals, but not to the point that they're getting, badly damaged and sort of destroyed. We want the trees to survive. Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I don't want it to be a fobby off answer, but it just completely depends on things like species and what is browsing those trees. So different livestock will browse in different ways. The cattle sort of strip with their tongue. and things like that. So they'll sort of strip branches. We saw from that video of the cattle eating the hawthorn, really having a great time stripping. But horses might do a lot more sort of bark stripping and nibbling, because they have sort of that more cropping technique with their teeth. So it's all those sorts of things. Sheep and goat like to go up on their back legs and go into the higher bits of the trees. So you just have to be aware of those sorts of things. And then the sort of length of time that you might have your animals, you know, browsing on them as well. If they're in for a long time amongst your trees, they're going to go to town probably having a great time stripping and eating and nibbling. But if you're doing it on a more rotational process, then they'll be able to go in, browse, sort of a low kind of impact level before being moved on. It allows the tree to recover, and things like that. So yeah, it kind of depends on, you know, like what sheep, even coming down to the sheep species and the cattle species. Even between sheep, some sheep just prefer to be grazing away, nibbling, and others really like browsing. So yeah, it kind of depends on those sorts of things. But yeah, I definitely say to the point where they aren't maybe as well going to get pushed over, or that kind of rubbing activity isn't going to damage them as well structurally. You know, when they're really, really nice and solid in the ground, that's a good way of knowing if they're going to be okay being amongst livestock. I didn't know if you had anything else, Eleanor.
No, just to let people know there is capital funding that can be paired with capital for agroforestry trees. So I think it's T8 and a range of others potentially. I've seen a lot of homemade guards as well, which like the examples I used were actually on willow trees with some old tubing up along the top, but some sheep were rubbing even at that stage. So I mean, it's very much on establishment. Guarding can be quite important, and it's that cost benefit analysis as well. So if it's looking a lot more efficient to actually electric fence rows of trees and plant perhaps almost like a plant to distract the livestock from that main specimen tree, then yeah, I've seen some examples of that where the tree is protected by everything else that the livestock can browse on. So yeah, but if they've got good grass and lots of opportunities to browse, then hopefully they won't focus in on just the one poor tree in the middle. But yeah,
Thank you. I love that it goes down to the individual personality of the sheep and what their specific tastes. Craig had a question around pigs and whether pigs would be a good option for silver pastoral. I'll go to either.
fantastic option.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think pigs can be pigs are woodland environments, I think, especially. I've forgotten what that name, the pigs who are fed on
Panage?
fed on
Yep.
acorn. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it creates a really unique taste. But instead of silver pastoral, I think it's just being aware that if they're in quite a confined space, the sort of soil overturning and sort of wallowing impact might need to be considered with tree species that can deal with that. But I don't know, Holly, if you've got experience in trees and
pigs, yeah.
pigs.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well that pigs and woodland go really well together. It's sort of where they're meant to be, and you could argue. It's just being aware that as with all things, you need to think about your objectives. And I know we keep bringing it back to that, but if you are wanting to keep the pigs in one certain area for a long time, they are quite destructive in their browsing sort of processes. They will rootle and things like that. Again, in a kind of mob grazing strategy, we can move the pigs through woodland quite regularly, sort of rotationally, you know, move them around the different sort of grazing and browsing areas. That can be really, really beneficial. It stops them, you know, kind of really poaching one area, which can then be detrimental to trees, you know, root damage and things like that. But yeah, absolutely, they can be a really, really good tool to, you know, be rearing these animals. It goes back to that shade and shelter aspect as well. You know, they will lots of different breeds and types of pigs have very little sort of protection on their skin from the weather damage, the sun damage, and things like that. So if you're having them outside, trees are only going to be beneficial. And as Eleanor mentioned, that kind of selling point of having pigs that have been browsing on acorns and different things like that is very appealing. I was just going to mention, I think I put in the chat about the open agroforestry weekend, which is a great opportunity to see which areas, which farms have sort of opened their doors for the weekend, so you can go and visit and see what they're doing. I don't know if the Trefusis estate is doing it, but if you go on YouTube or have a Google of the Trefusis estate, they do have pigs in their woodlands there quite successfully. So yeah, research, case studies, lots of homework for people to be doing for these different things, I'd say.
Thank you. We've got some more questions around the PA4. So what level of support can people expect from Forestry Commission, Natural England, where what's available under PA4 basically? And if any?
Yeah, I can see that Joe's provided quite a helpful answer there. Typically we've in terms of inquiries, we've been chatting to people at lots of different stages of their agroforestry sort of interest, and sometimes it's been before they started a PA4. We're available for a phone call just to chat about perhaps your options, or direct you to any useful resources that might help inform your decision a bit further. Like Joe said, we can't sort of write your application for you. We're not in that position, but we are here to review your sort of completed first draft, and consult with and work with Natural England at that stage. But it doesn't mean you can't get in contact with us just for a chat and maybe a visit before you start your PA4 as well. But it's we're sort of open doors. It can be a very creative process. So just let us know.
I would also say that is why we are running these kind of webinars, to support people who are thinking of getting that plan together, just to give you that food for thought. You will have to do your own homework. There are things that you need to read and understand, but all of that research will really help you put in a good application. And Joe, did you want to come in as well and add?
Yeah, just on that advice stuff, there's an agroforestry show which I think which they hold every other year in September time. So this September they'll be running their second one. It's a great opportunity. They have loads of brilliant speakers and they chat about every type of agroforestry system there are. You can go to loads. We should be there as well, I think. So yeah, you'll be able to get loads of advice at that show as well. It is well worth going up to there. I think was it up in Gloucestershire, Holly? Swindon area, wasn't it?
It's Hertfordshire.
Hertfordshire, thank you, Becca. It's a really great day out and great lunch provided as well. So I'll recommend it.
Thanks so much for that, Joe. We have come to the end of our questions, so unless anybody else, Richard B, can cactus guards be used as protection? I'm seeing a yes. Yes, they can be. Unless anyone else has got anything they wanted to come in with just before we head off. Again, I wanted to say a massive thanks to Holly and Eleanor, our resident experts in the Southwest. And yes, we do have a version of Holly and Eleanor in the other regions across England, and we will share their contact details. So if you are from another region, there will be somebody else to support you, even if it's not Eleanor and Holly. And thanks as well to our colleague Joe, a land use advisor in the Southwest, who can support on all things woodland creation. So again, we'll provide details for our land use advisors because they are there to give that advice, come out on site, have a look at your project, have a look at your ambitions, talk through your objectives. And yeah, so please do get in touch with us. There's no other questions, so I'm going to say good afternoon to everybody. I hope you get to enjoy the sunshine at lunch and speak soon. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.